Good morning and welcome to today's video from Yoker Evangelical Church. Today is Monday the 4th of May, and this morning in our church Bible reading plan we read Numbers chapter 11 and Psalm 48. And in this video I'd like us to take a look at Numbers 11, because as we enter this big section of narrative where it becomes more story, I think this book can really help us as we seek to walk through the wilderness. Why do I say walk through the wilderness? It's because there's a lot of similarities between the people that Moses is leading through the desert and Christians today. Both are groups of people who have been rescued by God, who are headed towards God's promised place for them, and are at the moment having to struggle through living for God in a world that is set against them. There are similarities in that we have the same God and that the same temptations will face us. That's why Christians today can talk about living in a wilderness. And in facing those temptations, there is a pattern that we see in the book of Numbers. And we see that captured at the start of chapter 11. So I'd like to take a look at those verses. There we read, "Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord. And when he heard them, his anger was aroused. Then fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. When the people cried out to Moses, he prayed to the Lord and the fire died down. So that place was called Taberah, because fire from the Lord had burned among them." The pattern that we see there, that is repeated again and again in the book of Numbers, is that the people complain, that they face God's judgment because of their complaining, that they then turn, they repent, and they go to Moses for help. Moses prays to God. And then fourthly, God relents from his anger. He turns away from them. And then as we see in the book, they go right back to step one and start complaining again. They get into a pattern of grumbling. And I think there is a real danger of that for Christians today. We can fall into this same trap of being rescued people who start to grumble against the God who has rescued us. We see two dangers, I think, in chapter 11 that show us just how easy this is to slip into. The first is that we start to get a rosy view of our past. Just listen to what the Israelites were complaining about. The rabble with them began to crave other food. And again the Israelites started wailing and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." As the people are walking through the desert, God is giving them stuff to eat, this manna. And yet in their hearts and with their voices, they are complaining against that. And they're actually saying things were better in Egypt. Somehow they get this rosy view of when they were slaves back in Egypt. And their hearts start to long to go back to there. But that is a danger for Christians as well. That we start to look back to our life when we were captive to sin and think, weren't things better then? Wasn't my life easier? Wasn't I happier before Jesus saved me? And when we go down that route, there is a temptation that we will grumble like the people in the desert. Secondly, we might start to grumble because we think we deserve better. We talked a little about this in the sermon yesterday, but we see it in Numbers as well. Listen to what Moses says. "Moses heard the people of every family wailing at the entrance to their tents. The Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. He asked the Lord, 'Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me?'" As Moses looks at his situation, he complains against God and says, "I didn't ask for this. God, why have you done this to me?" In his heart, I think Moses is complaining because he doesn't think he deserves this. He wants better. He doesn't want to have to be responsible for all these people. He goes to God and says, I think I deserve more. And how often have we said that in our hearts? When we face trials and temptations, so often our first protocol is to blame God. Why? Because we think we deserve better from Him and that He's let us down. So how does Numbers help us to avoid these traps that we can so easily fall into? Well, I think firstly, as we read through this book, we will see time and time again how patient God is with people who turn away from Him, how much mercy, how much grace He has on them, even when they are speaking ill directly to His face. This book reminds us that we have a God who is merciful, and so when we do mess up, and we will, we can look at Numbers and remember that God is patient with His people, and that He is ready to forgive. We can also see uses of Numbers as we look in the New Testament. The New Testament will always help us to understand the Old Testament, and the Old Testament will always help us to understand the New. And I'd like to read from 1 Corinthians, because there are verses there that help us to understand the book of Numbers. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples, and were written down as a warning for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. Paul says the example that we get here is a bad one. The Israelites are a cautionary tale as we look through Numbers and see how many times they mess up. We're meant to be able to say, let's not do that. Let's take the warning, let's look at their cautionary tale and not follow what they did. Because of those two reasons, Numbers is ultimately a book that encourages us to keep going. It is a book that says you are a weak people, you are going to struggle in following God, but you have a great God who is gracious with you and who has given you examples of what not to do to help you as you walk with Him through the wilderness. I'm going to finish with a verse from Hebrews that encourages us to keep going with this example in mind. Let us, therefore, make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. Let us, therefore, make every effort. God bless, and have a good day.